Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the series on the Bogo-Indian Defense with what is considered to be the main line, or at least the main line after the most common move for white. So, I hope you've seen the introductory video to the Bogo, where I've tried to explain a lot of key ideas and plans for both sides. In this video, we are going to be focusing on the move Queen e7. So let's get into the opening. So we have d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Now, as I've said before, it's possible for white to go three different ways here. g3, knight c3, or knight f3. Knight c3 allows the Nimzo-Indian, which is something most players tend to avoid these days, and which is something the Bogo-Indian player has to know. So, if white plays knight c3, you have to play the Nimzo, and bishop b4 is the best move by far. I'm going to get to that in a second with a bit more info. If g3 is played, then we have Catalan positions, and white is playing a fianchetto structure. If knight f3 is played, black has a choice between three different things. He can play the Bogo with bishop b4, he can play the Queen's Indian with b6, or he can try to transpose to the QGD with pawn to d5. After d5, white could still go for the Catalan, or he could play knight c3, playing the normal Queen's Gambit declined lines. After knight f3, the Bogo, there are two moves, bishop d2 and knight d2. So far, we've been looking at bishop to d2, and today we are going to be looking at the main line after this move. Knight d2 is considered by many Bogo-Indian players and by most theoreticians on the Bogo to be much trickier for black to face and to be a better option for white. And I think it's slowly catching up as the main idea in this opening. But okay. Bishop to d2. So far, we have been looking at the exchange, taking the bishop, and we've also looked at a5, c5 and a5, defending the bishop with a pawn. Now, one could argue that defending the bishop is more useful than taking on d2, and that's probably true because you don't waste as much time and you achieve something in the process. And so far, the option with a5, the so-called Nimzowitsch variation, goes in line with black's strategy. And in this opening, regardless of what black chooses, you are employing a dark squared strategy, meaning that you want your pawns on the dark squares, and you want to be using these as, well, entry points into white's position. So playing the move a5 makes a lot of sense, because in this type of structure, you have the option to go knight a6, knight c5, you can play knight d7, knight c5. This prevents b4 and it also defends the bishop. Bear that in mind while we cover the main line with queen to e7, which is also a move that defends the bishop. Now, a bit more about the Nimzo, which is still a very similar type of opening, and what's going on here is black is trying to fight for the control over e4, and usually in Nimzo type of structures, the ideal setup for black, if white allows that, would be with a fianchetto and then with pawns on dark squares, and you can try to control this long diagonal and prevent the move e4. We cannot do that in the Bogo. It's not the same, but we have different ideas, which some of them tend to be similar, some plans tend to be similar, and the pawn structures we are trying to achieve are going to be similar as well. So, queen to e7, excuse me, bishop to d2, queen to e7, the Nimzowitsch variation, and this has been the main line for a long time. I mean, it makes a ton of sense to defend with the queen. Now, obviously, white does not want to take. Taking on b4 is not a move. I think I'm not sure it has ever been played in a serious game. There are two options here for white. One of them is to play g3 setups, one of them is to avoid g3 setups. Now, playing g3 makes perfect sense. Black's queen side is undeveloped, that's one thing. This is the weakest diagonal on the board. You're trying to achieve e4, and also you're putting pressure on the weakness on b7, so that makes a ton of sense. Since black is content with giving up this bishop, as we are going to see, white has to make some use of the dark squares, but ironically, he can never do that, despite black giving up the defender of the dark squares. So g3 setups are the most sensible. If if white tries to avoid that, and I want to talk about that fairly briefly, g3 is by far the main move. If, for example, knight c3 is played, then I'm not going to go into the lines. I'll just give you the plan and the idea of how to play against this. What you're going to do, which you never do in normal lines, is play b6. And the idea behind b6 is that since white hasn't played g3 straight away, you now have time for b6, bishop b7. So if white plays g3 now you play bishop to b7, he plays bishop to g2, and you castle. And you have challenged this diagonal. This is very important. And this is now going to resemble the fianchetto Nimzo, and of course this is a normal position, but this is considered a slight success for black. And if white allows b6, bishop to b7, then black will have a much easier time equalizing the position. Therefore, white should play g3 straight away. Now, of course, the same thing doesn't work as well. b6 now, and there would be a ton of discoveries, and black has to do something else. So now I'll give you a brief overview of what black is trying to do. As I said, we don't mind trading this bishop off. In some lines we will be trading it for the d2 bishop, in other lines we will be trading it for the c3 knight. I will show you the difference. The main thing is, we are trying to play e5, d6, having the knight on c6 or waiting in the back on b8, and we are trying to use, in particular, the c5 square to launch a queenside attack. And in many positions in the Nimzowitsch main line of the Bogo, it is white's queenside that's going to suffer, while on the other hand, black's kingside is going to be safe. And unlike some other openings, white is not going to have such a clear plan of attack, whereas black has. It's like a red flag to a bull, this setup. Okay, so what we do, we play knight c6. Now, it is possible to avoid knight c6, and I'll show you the advantages of that move, of not playing knight c6 a bit later on. But basically, we want to play knight c6 to make this diagonal tactically more secure. That's going to be very important. And also, it's important to know that this knight is not going to stay on c6, even if we do play it there. What's going to happen, once we achieve our dream position with the pawns, so this pawn chain e5, d6, c7, this knight is going to read out either b8, d7, c5, or b8, a6, c5. And for the moment, this is a necessary piece, controlling the center, putting pressure on d4, but later on it's going to be used in a different way. There are two moves for white here, and this is going to be the main branching of our position: knight c3 and bishop to g2. And if bishop to g2 is played, we of course have the option of taking here. If knight c3 is played, we don't have the option of trading bishop for bishop. So let's get into the opening. Let's get into knight c3 first. So knight c3 I think is slightly more popular, although I think you will see knight c3 about 50% of the time in practical play. Now, what this move does, it restricts the bishop, and of course in some lines, for example, black plays a stupid move. Let's play a stupid move, a6, a3. Now, a6 goes against your strategy. You don't need a pawn on a6, you don't want to play b5 just yet. And if you don't want to trade, playing bishop a5, for example, would run into b4 and c5, and this is just a dreadful position. So you would be forced to take, of course, giving white an easier time to control the queen side. So after knight c3, the principled move is to just snap that knight off. White, of course, takes with the bishop. And we have given up our bishop for the knight. However, since we have a clear structure we are going for, we don't mind that, and let me show you why. It's going to be very different with bishop to g2, but this trade, the very early knight c3 and bishop takes, allows the move knight e4. And now, of course, we are in complete control over the e4 square, and it's not easy to evict this knight. Of course, bishop to g2 is going to be played, knight d2 could be played, but then we can just take the bishop off on c3, and for the moment, black is controlling this. Now, don't be tempted into playing f5. this is not the same as the Dutch. It's not the same as some Queen's Indian lines. If you play f5 too early, then d5 could be a move that completely destroys your position. So let's have a look at an example. So rook c1, of course, you don't want to allow knight c3, ruining the pawn structure. And black castles, fine. We did something useful, bishop to g2. And now f5 seems like a natural move, but in most cases, in this line is going to be a mistake. Why? Because after d5, white strikes out, because after f5, white strikes out with d5, and your center is collapsing. So for example, you takes, and now the knight has to move. You don't really want to take, and after knight d8, c5. And basically, the main battlefield black wants to fight on has been handed to white for no reason and with no compensation. Black has nothing on the queen side. In fact, he is underdeveloped. He's never going to achieve his ideal setup, because if you make a mistake, for example, then of course d6 is coming and you're basically getting destroyed. So you would have to take here, and this is just a dreadful position. So f5 is a move you don't really want to play, even though all the pieces seem to be perfectly placed for such a Queen's Indian / Dutch setup. What you do is you play d6. Okay, and now if white does nothing, if white does not play energetically, then black will get a long way. So if, for example, e5 is allowed, then d5 and here, and black has his dream setup. So in these knight c3 lines, when this knight has been put to e4, then white has to play energetically and plays d5 straight away. And notice that this is way safer for black than with the pawn on f5. It gives you much more options. So knight c3, rook c3, and knight b8. And we know what we're trying to do. We want to go for a dark squared setup. And if white allows that, for example, white castles, we would play e5 and be extremely happy. Playing c5 very early on doesn't really work. If c5 is played, I'm going to show you one game where Anand got destroyed because of the very early c5. You don't mind this. You don't mind this trade, and he's basically wasting time. Okay, so after knight b8, white has to trade this d6, fe6. This is why we need our f-pawn. White finally castles, and now the knight reroutes knight to d7. And you can see how useful it would be if we already had our bishop over here. Okay, knight d4, preventing any b6 ideas, attacking b7, knight f6, queen to d2. And now we can see the main battlefield in this variation, in knight c3. The main battlefield after knight c3 is going to be for the d6 square, and for black, the f2 square. So what we have to do in this position is take control over our dark square. So we have to play e5, otherwise this bishop is bad. So e5. The knight drops back to c2, bishop to e6. Now, of course, taking wouldn't be good here because we forced the knight back, and if bishop e7, then rook b8. Okay, and if rook b3, then bishop c4. So knight e3 played, defending this, and you have to play c6. And now you can see that white has a clear target here, the pawn on d6. However, I'll just show you the structure for a second. I'll try to show you the plans before we get into the moves. It's clear that white is going to triple up over here. What you can do is use your knight, play knight e8, defend this forever, and then try to distract white's pieces by attacking f2. So your rook is already placed on f8. What you can do is play queen f6, for example, and then put pressure on f2, distracting one of the pieces. And of course, if this is not dropping and if this is not dropping, it's going to be an equal position. And with perfect play, that's going to be the struggle, the main struggle in the game, with perfect play for both players. However, why do I think this is less pleasant for white than for black? Well, if you drop the d6 pawn, you're not going to lose. If you drop f2, it's very likely you will just resign a few moves later. So white's target is more pressures, let's put it that way. The second point is black's weakness can be dissolved. Not easily, okay, because this bishop is on g2. But if you manage to play d5, then you no longer have a weakness. And basically achieving d5 would mean that black gained something positionally. So let's have a look at that in practice. For example, rook to d3, very natural. Rook a to d8, again, very natural. Rook to d1, tripling up, we have to defend, knight d8, fine. Now, how does white continue? How do you put more pressure? Of course, c5 is out of the question because d5 would be just, I would say, winning for black on the highest level. Queen a5 has been tried, you can just defend. b3, for example, freeing up your knight. Black can play rook to d7, sometimes preparing to double, sometimes preparing to triple on the f-file. For example, queen d2 drops back, queen f6, the rook has to go back, and this position has been achieved several times. As I said, white's target is more tender. And also, what black can try to do, which white cannot, is launch a sort of minority attack on the queen side. And if you can achieve something like a5, a4, breaking up these pawns and creating a target, then you might have something, claiming the a-file. That being said, the position is equal and neither side should have a lot. Okay, so that's what happens if in this position bishop to g2, knight c3 is played. Let's have a look at bishop to g2 now. One thing I would like to mention before we get into bishop to g2 is I mentioned that black does not have to play knight to c6. I didn't explain that earlier because I would like to show you the main line after bishop to g2 first. So, okay, bear in mind that knight c6 doesn't have to be played. I'll explain it as soon as we finish this. So again, we play our main move knight c6. In this case, white plays bishop to g2. And again, what you have to remember is whenever g3, knight c6 is played, whatever white plays, either knight c3 or bishop g2, you just take. If there's a knight on c3, you take the knight. If there's no knight, you take the bishop. Again, you don't want any trouble with, for example, bishop to c1. And we saw this earlier. For example, castles, d6 and bishop to c1. And all of a sudden, this bishop is stranded. You have no squares. So, for example, bishop d7, a3. And, well, this is no good. So, basically, whenever white tries to castle quickly, which is going to be every game, you trade this bishop off. So bishop takes. It's possible to take with the queen. It's also possible to take with the knight. Taking with the knight, I think, is slightly more precise. And now, let's go for the dream setup. d6, e5. This is the dream setup. d6, castles. a5 first. This prevents b4, which means that you have control over c5. That's going to be very important. And in this position, white can play the move e4. It's defended against because he took with the knight, and this is the expansion he wants to make. Now, the automatic response against e4 is e5. If you don't play e5, you are worse. This is scary, and this is scary as well. So you have to prevent white from expanding. So you play e5. Now let's have a look at what happened. d5. Now, of course, you wish this knight was still on b8. If the knight was still on b8, you wouldn't have to move it there. And you could already play knight d7 or knight a6 and start putting pressure on c5. This is the key structure we are going to look at. And let's have a look at it here. So, what can we say about this structure? The first thing is, if we put this pawn on g6, this would be a King's Indian defense. And as we know, in the King's Indian, the bishop on g7 is a very unhealthy piece. That may seem strange if you have no experience with the King's Indian, but basically, when this central lockdown happens, so d6, e4, e5, d5, this bishop has no scope. What you get in the Bogo-Indian is that this bishop is already off the board, so you have the King's Indian without two very significant factors. One is a bad bishop on g7, the other is a quick kingside attack. So this is going to be a favorable King's Indian for black from a positional standpoint, and an unfavorable one from a tactical standpoint. Black is not going to have as many attacking opportunities. However, in the King's Indian, usually black just storms the king side, and white does this. White does the same thing. White tries to expand on the queen side with c5. In the Bogo-Indian, white is not going to have a king side attack, and black is going to be better on the queen side. So this structure is going to be the key structure you play in the Nimzowitsch variation of the Bogo. And let's have a look at what has to be done. So I will go over the moves in a second. What black has to do here, ideally he would like to control c5, so if white knows what he is doing, he's going to play a3 b4. If a3 b4 is not played, for example, if the pawn is on a4 and the pawn is on b3, for example, then knight c5 and black has a great strategic position. And if the ideal setup for white is achieved, black has to break it up. Now, the way you do that is you play c6 and you prepare d5. Sometimes you can prepare b5 as well. And white will have to be extremely careful. So when c6 is played, white has to take this. And later on, let's say white plays something, we play d5, white plays b5, and this trade happens. This is going to be the most common late middle game structure you are going to be playing. Very often this pawn is going to be traded for this one, for example, queen takes, because we have a queen on e7, and since white has a knight here, for example, then knight takes e5. And it's obvious that white is going to be pushing this pawn, sort of the Grunfeld passed pawn, and black is going to be much better on the queen side. So this will be a sort of Grunfeld endgame struggle. Okay, coming back to the original structure. If white is not careful after c6, for example, white plays something, then you can play b5. And very often, this is going to give you great prospects, sometimes sacrificing a pawn, that doesn't matter, but it's going to give you great opportunities in the attack. So this is going to something you'll have to bear in mind. After c6, the main transformation of the position is going to happen. It's almost always correct for white to take and allow the unavoidable d5. Okay, let's continue. So this is a very key position. So we have, just a second, we have this central thrust with e4, e5, d5, and the knight retreats. Now, let's talk about this position strategically. What is black trying to do? Black is trying to play on these squares. And which piece would you like to trade off? That's a very important question in every position. Ideally, you would like to have this knight against this bishop, with everything else traded off. If you manage to achieve that, then your control over the dark squares is going to be supreme. Of course, white doesn't have his bishop anymore. The c1 bishop is gone. Of course, the f8 bishop is gone too. And again, we have this King's Indian locked pawn structure, in which, since white has all of his pawns on the light squares, this is basically a bad piece. And what black would like to do here is play bishop to g4 and take on f3. Therefore, let's play a bad move for white, b3. Makes no sense. Bishop to g4, the knight is pinned to the queen. Very often we can see this for white in the Benoni, because there's a black pawn on d6, white tries to play knight d2, knight c4. And this trade of bishop for knight is something black is trying to achieve in the Benoni. So black wants to play bishop g4 and trade off the knight. Therefore, white usually plays bishop e2 very early on before moving the knight out, so that in this position, for example, if there was a bishop on e2, white would play knight d2 and just avoid the trade. Since white played b3, bishop g4, queen unpins, and you snap that one off. Bishop takes. Now, immediately, there is more control over this square. Now, the last strategic quest should be to trade off these two. Or these two, doesn't really matter. Basically, if you manage to trade off one more pair of knights, you have a good knight versus bad bishop position in which c5 and d4 are your dream squares. And believe it or not, it's not too hard to get your pieces in there. And the queen side is the main battleground. Therefore, white needs to do something about that. It's impossible to play bishop e2. You could move your queen, but that's not considered very useful. So white plays the move knight e1, and this knight is going to be sitting extremely well on d3, putting pressure on e5, allowing f4, allowing c5 if the opportunities allow it. Black now finally castles. Knight d3, fine. Knight a6. You could play knight d7, but it makes no sense to block your bishop if you don't have to. Also, this prevents b4. The knight on d3 controls b4. So, for example, if you play knight d7, then b4. And takes, fine, you get the c5 square, but this pawn can be dissolved, and f4 is also a pawn break white could go for, whereas black only has c6, which is for the moment defended by this knight. So knight a6. a3, we know what white is trying to do. He's trying to play b4. Bishop to g4. There's really no good square for this bishop, so black develops it to g4 anyway. Again, he would like to trade off for the knight, and f3. The bishop drops back to d7, and now b4. And this is the key position where black has to start undermining this center. So c6, we already saw this. And now we know that d6 is the best move. If, for example, let's say rook c1 is played. If rook c1 is played, you could play b5 straight away. And if this happens, this pawn is going to be weak. If it's traded off, you really won't have too much trouble recapturing this pawn. So this is something white doesn't want to allow. This is just a sample way to show you a mistake. This is 6, therefore is correct. b6, queen c2 is played, reinforcing the queen side. And now what black wants to do, he wants to prepare the move d5. For example, rook f to b8, putting pressure on the queen side, threatening to take here. Rook a to b1, d5, breaking open the center. And if white takes twice, then this knight is going to be, well, a very good piece, and white doesn't really want to allow that. Again, this is weak, and white should avoid playing like this. So after d5, the correct continuation is always b5, trying to get some control. C takes b5, okay, and c takes d5 is what white should play. This, of course, would give black many more options. This knight is now pinned. If you manage to play d4, then you have a great passed pawn. So d5, b5, cb, cd. And now this trade that I was talking about, which is possible, you can take on a3 and white takes on e5. And this is a sharp position, which, I mean, any side could win. The engine gives white a slight edge. This is black's only bad piece, but its counterpart is also bad. And this happens if white plays correctly. If white doesn't play correctly, for example, coming back to this position, there are many ways for white to go wrong. For example, let's see. Let's say we play rook c1. Now, immediately, as soon as white is not going for this plan, you could try to block the queen side and sometimes get away with it. You could also try c6 straight away when white hasn't expanded, which limits white's options significantly. So when d5 comes, he doesn't have so much power on the queen side. Okay, let me show you one game. Okay, so we know this position. We know that here, knight e1 is the correct way to play, trying to avoid bishop to g4. This is the game Anand versus Michael Adams, in which Michael Adams played black and crushed Anand, and it was Anand that made the crucial error. Anand played the early c5, which is a King's Indian sort of plan. However, there's no kingside attack for black. Black is playing on this side of the board. So you could play bishop g4, that would be a good idea. However, what Adams did is equally good. He just put his king to safety first, and he wasn't afraid of this trade. After cd, cd, Anand had this idea to play knight h4, but after knight a6, knight c4, and queen to d8, just guarding the pawn, rook c1 was played. In this position, Adams went slightly wrong. He played rook e8, which doesn't really make sense. This is a move which, if you play, you want to put your rook back on f8. So what he could have done here is b5, for example, and the knight goes back to d2. You play bishop to d7, control the entire board. a3, for example, knight c5, and just this is a very dominant position. Look at the knights. He played rook e8. It's not a big mistake, but it's inaccurate. b3 preventing b5, knight c5, queen b6, And you can see that Anand managed to organize a sort of blockade. Knight c4, rook f1, knight c5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and of course here Adams is a pawn up for not too much. He has a great knight on c4, but yeah, okay, what happened was knight takes d6, and for tactical reasons this didn't work. But I wanted to show you this part with c5. So white trying to challenge the queen side too early will lead to trouble. Okay, again, the structures are going to be the most important thing about these positions. You have to master the structures, and as I said in the intro video, the Bogo is extremely complicated. Study games by great players in the Bogo, and you will see a combination of 20 different openings and 20 different plans, and things will get much clearer. I hope you got something from this video. We're going to continue with the last variation of the Bogo, which I would like to cover, which happens when in this position white plays knight to d2. This is the Grunfeld variation, and it's going to be very tricky for black. Okay, see you tomorrow with the next video. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.